Welcome to the Historical Podcast. In this episode, one will tell you about medieval warfare. The medieval era, often referred to as the Middle Ages, or, less accurately, the Dark Ages, commenced around 476 AD. This period followed a significant decline in Roman imperial power across Europe, marking a profound shift in political and social structures. Spanning approximately 1,000 years, the Middle Ages generally concluded between 1400 and 1450 AD. However, it is crucial to recognize that historical periods are not uniformly defined or experienced across all regions. For instance, in Spain, the medieval period is often considered to have ended later, around 1492, coinciding with the beginning of its modern era. This variation in temporal boundaries suggests that military evolution and its characteristics were not monolithic. Regions with prolonged conflicts, such as the Reconquista in Spain, likely sustained certain medieval military characteristics longer or adopted new ones differently due to continuous conflict and interaction with diverse forces, like the militarily advanced Islamic armies of their golden age. The era as a whole was characterized by human expansion, increasing centralization of power, and considerable political upheaval and violence, which ultimately laid the groundwork for many modern European nations. In the earliest Middle Ages, the nature of warfare was largely decentralized. Military service was an obligation of every noble, who was expected to respond to the call to battle by bringing their own equipment, archers, and infantry. This system, while a necessity given the prevailing social order, frequently resulted in motley forces characterized by variable training, equipment, and abilities. Such armies were often small and inherently unreliable, leading many commanders to prefer alternatives to large-scale pitched battles. Indeed, major pitched battles were relatively rare occurrences. Wars often consisted primarily of sieges, skirmishes, and raids, which could cause even more widespread death and destruction than a single decisive engagement. The preference for raids, or chevauchée, which involved ravaging enemy resources, was not merely a tactical choice, but a direct consequence of fundamental constraints on offensive military power. These constraints included significant logistical limitations, the prohibitive cost of maintaining large, standing forces, and the inherent difficulty of command and control over disparate feudal levies. Consequently, early medieval warfare was often a protracted war of attrition and resource denial rather than a series of decisive engagements, profoundly shaping the landscape and economy through repeated plundering, arson, rape, slaughter, and famine. This period witnessed the rise of the horse as a dominant military resource, leading to the formation of formidable heavy cavalry units, epitomized by the knight. Concurrently, fortifications, particularly castles, became indispensable elements of warfare, offering crucial safety and refuge from larger invading armies. The strategic dynamic was clear. The overwhelming ability of heavy cavalry to dominate open fields was rendered useless against well-constructed fortifications. This reality meant that castles allowed nobles to establish and maintain dominion over regions, providing protection to the local populace. The continuous interplay between mobile offensive forces and static defensive structures, coupled with the evolving role of the king in raising and financing these forces, fundamentally shaped medieval military strategy and the political landscape. This dynamic created an ongoing arms race between offensive capabilities, such as cavalry and siege engines, and defensive capabilities, primarily castles. The escalating expense of building and maintaining castles, raising war horses, and equipping professional armies meant that only the wealthiest elites and, increasingly, centralized monarchies could afford to dominate warfare. This financial imperative gradually shifted power away from individual nobles towards the crown, indicating a long-term trend from decentralized feudal conflict towards more centralized, state-controlled military endeavors. Part 1. The King's Authority and the Raising of Armies. Feudalism and Military Obligation. Feudalism emerged as a dominant governing system in Europe around 450 AD, following the Germanic invasions that led to the fall of Rome. Its origins were primarily between the Rhine and Loire rivers, but it rapidly spread across Italy, England, much of Central and Horace Archer Europe, and even the Holy Land, reaching its full maturity around the 11th century and continuing to grow into the 13th century. At its core, feudalism established a hierarchical web of alliances and oaths of loyalty and service. At the apex was the king, who granted tracts of land, known as fiefs, to high-ranking nobility, such as barons, in exchange for their allegiance. These barons, in turn, might grant smaller parcels of land to knights, who swore homage and fealty to them, creating a cascading system of obligations. This hierarchy extended down to the serfs, who, while legally bound to the land, owed a certain amount of work and crops each year to the knights or lords they served. A cornerstone of this system was the oath of fealty, a solemn promise of support and loyalty typically sworn in God's name over a holy artifact. Vassals were expected to provide troops, military service, and garrison for their lord's castle. However, a significant limitation of this system was that a typical feudal military service obligation was generally limited to around 40 days, a period often insufficient for extended campaigns. As the feudal system began its decline near the end of the 13th century, a notable shift occurred. Vassals increasingly preferred to provide monetary payments, known as scutage or shield money, instead of offering personal military service. This transition from direct military service to monetary compensation marked a critical step towards the monetization and professionalization of medieval armies. This financial flexibility allowed kings to hire more reliable mercenaries and contract-based forces, thereby reducing their dependence on potentially unreliable and often motley feudal levies. This change directly contributed to the centralization of military power under the crown, as kings could now purchase the military service they needed, rather than relying solely on inherited obligations. The inherent limitations of the feudal system for large-scale, sustained warfare, such as the short terms of service and the variable quality of feudal troops, created a powerful impetus for kings to seek alternative methods of army raising and financing. This systemic weakness of feudalism as a military model ultimately contributed to its decline and spurred the development of more robust state mechanisms for war. The increasing expense and scale of warfare, particularly evident in prolonged conflicts like the 100 Years' War, necessitated a modernization of taxation. This pressure for sustained, effective armies forced rulers to overcome the limitations of the decentralized feudal system, leading to financial and administrative innovations that strengthened the state at the expense of fragmented noble power. Army composition and evolution. In the early Middle Ages, military forces were a diverse assortment. Feudal armies typically comprised a core of highly skilled knights and their personal household troops, supplemented by mercenaries hired for the duration of a campaign, and feudal levies. While the core units were often well-trained, feudal levies were frequently described as little more than rabble, though they could prove effective in advantageous terrain. During this early period, from the 5th through the 11th centuries, infantry played a dominant role in Western warfare, as advancements in mounted combat were still limited, and knights were not yet consistently effective against organized footmen. The late Middle Ages, however, witnessed a profound transformation in army composition. This period saw the significant formation of disciplined infantry units and the advent of the Gunpowder Revolution, which together necessitated the growth of professional armies. A prime example of this shift was the emergence of the Swiss pikemen, who became renowned throughout Europe for their discipline and exceptional effectiveness against cavalry. Their innovative use of long pikes in densely packed, flexible, and aggressive formations allowed them to achieve significant victories against mounted knights, forcing their opponents to adapt. Similarly, the English and Welsh longbowmen represented another highly effective, specialized force, comprising a substantial portion, sometimes up to 80%, of armies like Henry V at Agincourt. These archers could deliver a rapid rate of fire, penetrating mail, and even damaging plate armor. While truly large, standing armies remained rare due to their immense cost, some notable exceptions began to appear towards the end of the period, such as the Janissary Corps of the Ottoman Empire, the Black Army of Hungary under Matthias Corvinus, and the small army raised by Louis IX of France. Beyond these professional corps, village militias and other regional military groups were common, particularly along frontiers, and could be recruited into larger armies when needed. Free farmers and townspeople often owed military service to their local lords and would typically fill the ranks as foot soldiers, archers, or light cavalry. The evolution from motley feudal levies to specialized infantry, such as pikemen and longbowmen, and the eventual emergence of professional armies, represents a fundamental shift from a warrior aristocracy to a more meritocratic and technologically driven military. This transformation was driven by the increasing ineffectiveness of traditional heavy cavalry against disciplined infantry formations and the superior range and penetration of missile weapons. The tactical limitations of the dominant cavalry, which often struggled to perform cohesive charges and were vulnerable to well-organized foot troops, directly led to the rise in prominence of infantry. This change in military effectiveness and structure marked a significant move away from the individualistic combat of knights towards a greater emphasis on unit cohesion and specialized roles, fundamentally reshaping the battlefield. Financing medieval warfare. Medieval rulers operated under far more stringent financial constraints than modern states, lacking the sophisticated tools of national tax systems, conscription, or extensive public credit. Nevertheless, they employed various methods to raise the substantial funds required for military campaigns. These included direct taxes levied on property or goods, indirect taxation primarily through customs duties, especially lucrative wool subsidies, fines, and the sale of warships or royal property. English kings, for example, were adept at exploiting archaic land taxes, managing vacant bishoprics, pocketing profits from minting, and collecting various feudal dues. Crucially, regular access to credit was indispensable for kings to ensure the smooth running of governmental administration and to finance their ambitious foreign policies. Monarchs frequently sought loans from wealthy individuals, such as the Hull merchant William de la Pole, and from powerful Italian banking societies, including the Ricciardi and Frescobaldi. These loans were often secured against future royal revenues, most notably customs duties on wool exports, and could be remarkably substantial. For instance, the Ricciardi provided over £40,000 for the First Welsh War in 1277 and nearly £100,000 for the Second Welsh War of 1282 to 1283. This reliance on loans from wealthy merchants and banking societies reveals the nascent financial sophistication of medieval states, but also their inherent fiscal fragility. The feasibility of large-scale military operations was directly linked to the availability and cost of credit, making financial markets an integral part of military strategy. If credit dried up, as happened to the Ricciardi in 1294 due to war-induced disruption, military operations were immediately impacted, highlighting a direct causal link between finance and military capacity. Waging war was an incredibly expensive undertaking, leading not only to heavy taxation but also, almost invariably, to the deliberate destruction of economic assets in enemy territory. The cost of maintaining even a small standing army was immense. For example, the entire royal income for the English crown in 1415, approximately £54,000, barely covered the annual wages for a hypothetical 500-man army at 12 pence per day per man. This immense financial strain often led to royal debt and desperate measures, like currency debasement, which further eroded the living standards of the populace and contributed to social unrest. The constant need to finance increasingly expensive warfare acted as a powerful catalyst for the development of more centralized and efficient state taxation systems. This modernization of taxation due to war strengthened monarchical power at the expense of the nobility and contributed significantly to the process of state building in countries like England, France, and Spain. The escalating costs of conflict created a feedback loop. War drove up expenses, forcing kings to find new revenue streams, which in turn led to stronger, more centralized financial administration, ultimately enhancing the state's ability to wage war, command, control, and intelligence. Medieval kings were expected to consult with and take advice from the leading churchmen and nobility of their kingdoms. These magnates, often tied to the king through kinship, ancestry, and land tenure, were considered natural leaders with both a right and an obligation to offer counsel. Meetings, frequently referred to as councils, or, in early instances, parliaments, were crucial forums for determining royal policy, including military strategy. Within the army itself, the king's counselors would meet to discuss battle plans, though authority over smaller groups was often sketchy and relied heavily on personal loyalty. Leading large medieval armies was inherently challenging due to their diverse composition, which included a mix of feudal levies, mercenaries, and household troops. Commanders frequently contended with issues such as boredom among troops during periods of inactivity, which could lead to internal problems. The difficulty in coordinating precise tactical moves was also a significant hurdle, as knights, for instance, often acted as individual fighters rather than cohesive units. The continuous swelling of French ranks by reinforcements before the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, for example, threw existing battle plans into confusion, illustrating the complexities of managing large, diverse forces. The primitive nature of medieval communication and intelligence meant that strategic decision-making was often based on incomplete or unreliable information. This inherent fog of war amplified the challenges of command and control, making precise, coordinated maneuvers difficult and often favoring simpler, more direct tactics or reliance on individual prowess. Despite these limitations, medieval rulers did employ various rudimentary methods for information gathering and communication. They relied on travelers such as merchants, pilgrims, and heralds for political news. Field commanders used explorators, primarily scouts, to reconnoiter terrain and assess enemy strength and movements. Some individuals acted as gentlemen spies, collecting information informally while traveling and passing it on to their governments. There is evidence, for example, that King Edward III of England had a secret intelligence system as early as the 1330s. The English administration in Calais, a garrisoned English fortress on the French coast for over 200 years, arguably functioned as the closest thing to a professional intelligence service in Europe at the time, gathering information from agents disguised as horse dealers, tinkers, or monks. On the battlefield, communication relied on a combination of horns, drums, flags, distinctive torch patterns at night, and messengers on horseback. The Mongols, in particular, excelled at secure communications, developing sophisticated arrow signal systems and pioneering the use of smoke and fire signals for long-distance operations. The development of these rudimentary intelligence networks and communication methods indicates an early recognition by rulers of the critical importance of information in warfare. This nascent drive for better intelligence and command, even if imperfect, foreshadowed the eventual professionalization of military staff and the rise of more complex strategic planning in later centuries. Part 2. Castles, Fortification and Siegecraft. The evolution of castle design. The concept of the castle, as it is commonly understood today, was introduced into England in 1066 during the Norman invasion led by William the Conqueror. Following their victory at the Battle of Hastings, the Normans rapidly constructed castles across the newly conquered territory to assert control and pacify the Anglo-Saxon population. These early fortifications were predominantly of the motte and bailey type. A motte consisted of a large earthen mound, often artificial, topped with a wooden tower, while the bailey was a large ditch and bank enclosure surrounding the motte, protected by a strong timber fence or palisade. These timber castles were relatively cheap and quick to build, with over 500 raised in the 20 years after 1066. However, their inherent vulnerability to fire and rot quickly became apparent. Consequently, many original timber castles were systematically replaced with more durable stone structures, often beginning with the central keep. The development of stone keeps marked the next significant phase in castle design. These massive stone towers became the central feature of castles, offering superior defense with their thick walls and limited, narrow windows. Early keeps were typically rectangular in shape, but builders soon recognized their vulnerability to damage by projectiles, particularly at the corners, which could be undermined during sieges. This led to an architectural evolution towards rounded or cylindrical keeps and later polygonal designs to mitigate these weaknesses. Notable examples include the polygonal keep at Orford Castle and the cylindrical designs at Conisper Castle and Longtown Castle. The pinnacle of medieval defensive architecture was reached with the development of concentric castles in the 12th and 13th centuries. These fortresses offered the best protection against attack due to their innovative multi-layered design. Their main feature was a series of thick stone walls, with an inner wall built higher than the outer, allowing archers positioned on the inner walls to fire over those on the outer walls. The space between these two walls was ominously known as the Death Hole, a lethal trap for any attackers who managed to breach the outer defenses. The rapid evolution of castle design from simple timber motte baileys to complex stone concentric castles reflects an ongoing arms race between defensive architecture and defensive siege technology. Each innovation in castle design was a direct response to the increasing effectiveness of siege engines and tactics. For instance, the destructive force of the trebuchet compelled engineers to thicken walls and round out towers, demonstrating a dynamic and adaptive military engineering landscape. This continuous cycle of adaptation and counter-adaptation, where offensive capabilities directly drove defensive architectural innovation, was a defining characteristic of medieval military development. Furthermore, the increasing complexity and cost of castle construction profoundly altered the power dynamics within medieval society. Only the wealthiest nobles, and, more significantly, the kings, could afford to build and maintain such formidable fortifications. Castles thus became not only symbols of wealth and power, but also crucial instruments of centralized authority, reinforcing the monarch's control. While many castles were initially granted by the king to loyal lords, the sheer expense of keeping pace with military innovation meant that kings could increasingly outspend their rivals, gradually diminishing the military independence of lesser lords and contributing to the centralization of political power. Evolution of medieval castle design and defensive features. Motte and bailey castles were built during the 11th to 12th centuries. They featured a timber or earth mound called a motte, topped with a wooden tower, and were surrounded by a ditch or bank and a wooden palisade in the bailey. Their primary purpose was to provide quick and initial defense. However, they were vulnerable to fire, rot, and had limited structural integrity. Stone keep castles emerged in the 12th to 13th centuries. These castles included thick stone towers, initially rectangular and later built in circular or polygonal shapes, with few windows and an outer stone wall. Their main defensive strategy was to provide a strong central point. Nonetheless, they were susceptible to projectiles striking square corners and to undermining by attackers. Concentric castles were constructed during the 13th to 14th centuries. They had multiple layers of thick stone walls, with the inner walls higher than the outer ones, and included turrets and a death hole between the walls. Their defensive approach was based on layered defense. Over time, they became vulnerable to early gunpowder weapons and prolonged sieges. Defensive features and strategies. Medieval castles were meticulously designed with a variety of architectural elements and active defensive measures to withstand prolonged sieges and inflict maximum damage on attackers. Core architectural features included immensely thick walls, often ranging from 2.5 to 6 meters in thickness, typically topped with crenellation or parapets to provide protection for defenders. Towers, integral to the castle's defense, were built tall for long-distance surveillance and incorporated narrow arrow loops, vertical slits that allowed archers inside to shoot arrows at attackers, while making it extremely difficult for attackers to return fire effectively. Gateways, the most vulnerable points, were heavily fortified, often positioned forward from the main castle, and protected by 4 buildings, massive iron gates, heavy wooden doors, or a combination of these, along with drawbridges. Beyond static architectural elements, defenders employed active defensive strategies designed to directly engage and harm besiegers. Murder holes, openings in walls or gates, allowed defenders to pour sewage, hot water, oil, or burning tar on those below. Similarly, machicolations were overhanging holes or platforms built into castles, enabling defenders to hurl items like rocks, arrows, or even animal dung at attackers directly beneath the walls. Castles also utilized projectile weapons for defense. Catapults, such as the trebuchet, a torsion-powered catapult, were commonly employed to hurl stones and other missiles at enemy siege engines and soldiers. Ballistas were also used, though less frequently. The introduction of cannons later in the period marked a significant shift. The first recorded defensive use of a cannon in Europe occurred during the Siege of Algeciras in 1343-44, demonstrating their devastating potential against siege engines and walls. Strategic placement was equally vital to a castle's defense. Many castles were deliberately built on natural hills, cliffs, or in close proximity to rivers or lakes, leveraging the terrain to create highly effective natural barriers. This careful site selection made direct assaults considerably more difficult and costly for besieging armies. The detailed and multi-layered defensive features of medieval castles illustrate a sophisticated understanding of defensive engineering aimed at maximizing attrition on besieging forces. The progression from passive defenses, such as thick walls, to active ones, like machicolations, murder holes, and defensive trebuchets, highlights a tactical evolution from simply withstanding an attack to actively inflicting damage on the attacker, making sieges as costly as possible. The art of siege warfare. Sieges constituted the most common form of medieval military confrontation, far more frequent than large-scale pitched battles. When a castle or fortified city could not be penetrated by direct assault, attacking forces would typically surround it, establishing a blockade to control the target until it surrendered due to starvation or disease. Active siege tactics involved attempts to breach fortifications by going over, through, or under the walls. This included direct assaults using scaling ladders, battering rams to force through gates or walls, and mining operations where tunnels were dug under a section of the wall and then collapsed to destabilize the foundation. Besieging armies deployed a wide array of specialized siege engines to overcome formidable defenses. These included scaling ladders for direct assault, battering rams to break down masonry walls or fortifications, and siege towers, large wooden structures on wheels that allowed attackers to climb up and over castle walls while offering some protection from enemy arrows. Various types of catapults were also employed, such as the mangonel, onager, and ballista, designed to launch heavy projectiles to break down fortifications or kill defenders. The trebuchet, a torsion-powered or counterweight-powered catapult, was particularly dominant in the Middle Ages due to its destructive force. With the development of gunpowder, early cannons also appeared, proving devastatingly effective against city walls and siege engines. The prevalence of sieges and the diverse array of siege engines underscore that medieval warfare was primarily a contest of engineering and logistics, not solely of pitched battles. The continuous development of increasingly powerful siege engines, culminating in the early use of cannons, directly drove the evolution of castle defenses and ultimately rendered traditional fortifications obsolete. Gunpowder weapons, capable of breaching castle walls and penetrating armor, forced armies to adapt their tactics and led to radical changes in fortification design, marking a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. Moreover, sieges were often protracted affairs, demanding significant logistical planning and resources to supply the besieging army. The ability to sustain a siege was a major challenge, often requiring extensive supply trains, the establishment of supply depots, and the procurement of provisions through local purchasing or, more commonly, looting. The logistical demands of prolonged sieges often limited the scale and duration of military campaigns, especially for less centralized powers. This meant that successful sieges required not only military might, but also significant administrative and economic capacity, further contributing to the advantage of emerging states with better financial and supply systems. The ability to effectively conduct a long siege became a direct measure of a ruler's logistical and financial strength, linking the military challenge of siege warfare to the broader trend of state building and the decline of fragmented feudal power. Part 3. The Art of Battle, Weapons, Armor, and Tactics. The Evolution of Medieval Weaponry. Medieval melee weaponry was remarkably diverse, evolving significantly throughout the period to counter advancements in armor and tactics. Swords, for instance, developed from the Roman spather into various forms, including the arming sword and long sword. Later designs, such as the Estoc featured an acute taper specifically developed to pierce mail armor. Other common melee weapons included battle axes, horsemen's picks, daggers, clubs, and maces, which provided blunt force trauma. Polearms were particularly versatile and effective, encompassing halberds, lances, military forks, weaponized pitchforks, and spears. The halberd, combining an axe, spear, and hook, was especially potent against armored knights, capable of dismounting them or delivering decisive blows. Ranged weapons played an increasingly critical role on the battlefield. Simple bows, typically under 5 feet long, were crafted from wood, often yew, and used with arrows fletched with goose feathers. The English longbow, a single-piece bow, though some later developed composite designs, was a formidable weapon. While difficult to master, requiring years of practice, a skilled longbowman could shoot approximately 12 shots per minute, a rate of fire far superior to competing weapons. Longbow arrows, particularly bodkin points, could penetrate contemporary mail and damage or dent plate armor, decimating French nobility at battles like Crécy and Agincourt. Crossbows, though much more expensive and slower to fire, a maximum of 2 or 3 bolts per minute for an expert, possessed greater penetrating power and required less training, making them popular among urban militias and mercenary forces. Other ranged weapons included throwing axes, javelins, and slings. The dawn of gunpowder marked a revolutionary shift in weaponry. The history of firearms began in 10th century China with the development of fire lances, tubes containing gunpowder projectiles mounted on spears. The earliest surviving firearm, a hand cannon, dates to 1288 in China. Knowledge of gunpowder weapons gradually spread through Eurasia by the 15th century. In Europe, smaller, portable hand cannons, known as sciapi, developed in Italy around the late 14th century, with the first recorded use of a firearm occurring in 1364. The matchlock gun, appearing around 1400, significantly improved aim by allowing both hands to remain on the weapon. Cannons, despite being slow to load, proved devastatingly effective against city walls and fortifications, fundamentally altering siege warfare. The continuous development of weaponry, from specialized piercing swords and versatile polearms to the increasing power of long-range missile weapons and the eventual introduction of gunpowder firearms, represents a constant escalation in lethality and a direct response to advancements in armor. This arms race fundamentally altered battlefield dynamics, gradually diminishing the dominance of heavy cavalry and emphasizing the necessity of combined arms tactics. Improvements in defensive capabilities, such as the emergence of plate armor, directly led to innovations in offensive weaponry, driving a continuous cycle of increasing destructive power and forcing tactical adaptation, such as the growing prominence of infantry. The armor race, chainmail versus plate. The evolution of medieval armor was a direct response to the increasing lethality of weapons, creating a continuous arms race between protection and penetration. Chainmail, consisting of thousands of interlocking metal rings, was the dominant protective armor of the early Middle Ages. It offered good protection against slashing and light stabbing weapons, was flexible, and relatively easy to repair by replacing damaged rings. Typically weighing between 15 to 20 kilograms, 33 to 44 pounds. Its weight hung from the shoulders, which could lead to fatigue during long marches or protracted battles. However, chainmail provided minimal defense against blunt force trauma from weapons like maces and war hammers, as kinetic energy could still pass through, causing fractures and concussions. Furthermore, it could be penetrated by specialized weapons such as spears, bodkin arrows from longbows, and the acutely tapered estoc sword. Plate armor, which emerged later in the medieval period, represented a significant leap in protective technology. It offered optimal protection against virtually every common medieval weapon type, with the notable exception of early gunpowder arms. Plate armor excelled at distributing impact energy across the entire steel surface, significantly reducing blunt force trauma and effectively deflecting blows. Despite common misconceptions, well-designed plate armor allowed for surprising mobility and agility, with historical accounts and modern experiments confirming that trained knights maintained a considerable range of motion. Average plate armor typically weighed slightly more than chainmail, between 20 to 25 kilograms, 44 to 55 pounds, but ingenious suspension systems distributed the load more effectively across the body and hips, reducing strain. Plate armor was, however, significantly more expensive to produce and required skilled armorers. Unlike chain mail, which could be forged by apprentices, the development of plate armor was a direct response to the increasing power of weapons. The introduction of the blast furnace in the 12th century and subsequent new hardening processes revolutionized iron production, enabling the creation of higher quality and greater quantities of metal suitable for armor. By the 15th century, full-plate suits largely replaced mail as the elite standard, often worn over or alongside chainmail to protect gaps at joints. This continuous arms race between armor and weapons highlights a dynamic feedback loop, where innovations in one field directly spurred advancements in the other. The shift from mail to plate armor was not merely a technological upgrade, but a strategic adaptation to the increasing lethality of piercing and blunt force weapons, ultimately influencing battlefield tactics by making knights more resilient but also more expensive. The escalating cost of advanced armor had profound social and economic implications. The expense of building castles, raising war horses, maintaining armor, and training for battle meant that only the wealthy elites could afford to dominate warfare. A typical imported suit of Milanese plate armor could cost the equivalent of 100 to 166 days, wages for an average knight, with ceremonial armor potentially costing millions in modern terms. This direct financial barrier reinforced the dominance of the wealthy elite in military affairs, contributing to the decline of the less affluent knightly class and further centralizing military power and prestige within the hands of kings and major nobles who could afford to equip their forces. The arms race was thus not just technological but also economic, exacerbating social stratification and concentrating military capability at the top of the social hierarchy. Battlefield formations and maneuvers. In the High Middle Ages, knights, primarily mounted warriors, dominated battlefields in Central and Western Europe between the 11th and 14th centuries. Their usual tactic was the frontal charge, where horsemen formed a line and galloped towards the enemy, aiming to break their ranks. However, these charges were often problematic because knights frequently acted as individual fighters rather than trained, cohesive units, making disciplined, closed-order charges difficult to perform. If such a charge went wrong, it could have dire consequences. Furthermore, the effectiveness of cavalry was limited against fortifications and increasingly against disciplined infantry formations. The late Middle Ages witnessed a significant tactical revolution with the rise of infantry dominance. Infantry played a crucial and often decisive role in battles. The Swiss, for example, perfected pike tactics, using long pikes and densely packed foot troops in flexible and aggressive formations, which proved highly effective against mounted knights. Their victories at Morgarten, Laupan, Sempak, Grandson, and Merton forced European princes to either hire Swiss pikemen or emulate their tactics. English longbowmen also became a formidable force, deployed in wings on the flanks of their armies to unleash clouds of arrows that disrupted enemy formations and funneled them into the central body of footmen. They were particularly devastating at Crécy and Agincourt, where thousands of French knights were brought down by armor-piercing bodkin point arrows. The shift from cavalry dominance to the ascendancy of disciplined infantry and massed archers represented a tactical revolution driven by weapon and armor developments. This forced a move towards combined arms warfare and more sophisticated battlefield formations, fundamentally altering how battles were fought and emphasizing unit cohesion over individual prowess. Beyond direct charges and static formations, medieval commanders employed various strategic maneuvers. Troops caught in the open could form a square or hedgehog formation, facing outward in all directions with pikes and crossbows to keep opposing cavalry at bay. The feigned retreat, a complex maneuver where troops pretended to flee to draw the enemy into a trap, was famously used by the Normans at Hastings. Other tactics included single or double envelopment, where the enemy's front was engaged while flanks were attacked, and hit-and-run tactics, often employed by nomadic horse archers. Exploiting natural terrain was paramount. Scottish victories at Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn, for instance, were won on fields where the English were foolish to fight, demonstrating how terrain could strongly favor one side. Similarly, at Agincourt, the English positioned their infantry with flanks covered by woods, negating the possibility of French cavalry flank charges and allowing them to focus on a head-on assault. The importance of terrain exploitation and the use of defensive fortifications, such as the wooden stakes driven into the ground by English archers at Agincourt, highlight that medieval battle strategy was often about creating and exploiting local advantages rather than relying solely on overwhelming numerical superiority. This demonstrates a pragmatic approach to warfare, where commanders sought to mitigate risks and maximize the effectiveness of their specific troop types in a given environment. Major medieval battles, tactics, and outcomes. Key battle case studies. Battle of Hastings, 1066. The Battle of Hastings was a pivotal engagement in 1066 that determined the fate of England. Harold Godwinson's English forces took a strong defensive position along a ridge, forming a shield wall, a dense formation of soldiers holding shields close together. This formation was considered almost impervious to cavalry, but offered little room for maneuver. William the Conqueror's Norman army, which included a substantial cavalry force of 2,000 to 3,000 mounted knights, faced the English. William's initial assaults, both infantry and cavalry, failed miserably against the resilient English shield wall. To overcome this stalemate, the Normans employed trick tactics, repeatedly feigning flight in mid-battle to entice the English to break their ranks and pursue them down the hill. This tactic was partly successful, leading some English forces to break formation, only to be surrounded and annihilated in Norman countercharges. The Norman use of combined arms, including archers and cavalry, contrasted sharply with the English reliance on foot soldiers, armed primarily with formidable two-handed battle axes. The English shield wall eventually broke, leading to a decisive Norman victory and the death of King Harold. Hastings illustrates an early clash between different military cultures. The Norman emphasis on combined arms and tactical flexibility versus the English reliance on a static, defensive shield wall. The Norman victory demonstrated the potential of coordinated cavalry and missile troops to break even formidable infantry defenses, foreshadowing later tactical developments that would favor more dynamic approaches. Battle of Crécy, 1346. The Battle of Crécy, a major engagement in the Hundred Years' War, saw the English army, led by King Edward III, facing a significantly larger French force. Edward III strategically positioned his army on a slope near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu, exploiting the high ground to gain a significant defensive advantage. The English further enhanced their position by digging numerous pits, a foot deep and wide, near the front line to impede French cavalry charges. English longbowmen were assigned positions on the flanks, almost like wings, allowing them to unleash a devastating crossfire that funneled the enemy into the central body of English men-at-arms. The English longbowmen decisively outshot and routed the Genoese crossbowmen on the French side. The battle resulted in a massive English victory, inflicting immense casualties on the French, particularly their nobility, despite the numerical disparity. Crécy was a watershed moment, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of massed longbow fire and disciplined infantry against traditional heavy cavalry charges. The English tactical innovation of using terrain, defensive obstacles like pits, and flanking archers to channel and decimate the enemy marked a significant shift in battlefield strategy, diminishing the perceived invulnerability of the knightly charge. Battle of Agincourt, 1415. The Battle of Agincourt, another major English victory in the Hundred Years' War, saw King Henry V exhausted and outnumbered army, approximately 6,000 men, with nearly 80% archers, confronting a much larger French force, estimated between 12,000 and 36,000. The battlefield was a narrow, muddy, recently plowed field situated between two woods, which significantly constrained large-scale French maneuvers and negated their numerical advantage. Henry V positioned his men-at-arms in the center, flanked by his longbowmen, who had driven pointed wooden stakes, or palings, into the ground at an angle to deter French cavalry charges. The French knights, weighed down by their heavy armor, struggled to advance across the muddy field, becoming easy targets for the furious bombardment of artillery. from the English archers, as more French knights crowded onto the narrow battlefield. Their mobility further decreased, with some lacking even the room to raise their arms and strike a blow. Henry V's controversial order to execute French prisoners during the battle was a strategic decision, made to prevent a potential counterattack from the large number of captives and allow his men to focus on the ongoing fight. The battle concluded in a stunning English victory with remarkably minimal casualties, around 400 English deaths compared to approximately 6,000 French, many of whom were noblemen, further cementing the longbow's reputation and Henry V's military prowess. Agincourt reinforced the lessons of Crécy, demonstrating the continued effectiveness of English longbow tactics even in unfavorable conditions like muddy terrain and against numerical inferiority. Henry V's strategic use of terrain, defensive stakes, and decisive command, including the brutal but pragmatic prisoner execution, highlights an adaptable approach to warfare that prioritized tactical advantage and attrition over traditional chivalric norms. Siege of Orleans, 1428 to 1429. The Siege of Orleans was a critical turning point in the Hundred Years' War, with the English besieging the strategically important city from October 1428. The French forces within Orleans were demoralized and disorganized, facing a well-entrenched English army that had fortified its positions with wagon parks and sharpened stakes. The arrival of Joan of Arc in April 1429 proved transformative. She brought much-needed supplies and reinforcements, but more importantly, she inspired the French to a passionate and determined resistance. Joan personally led charges and played a significant role in outlining military strategies and directing troops, even brandishing her banner in place of a weapon. Under her influence, the French adopted more aggressive tactics, culminating in a series of successful sorties that broke the English hold. The English retreated from Orleans on May 8, 1429. The lifting of the Siege of Orleans was a major French victory, largely attributed to Joan of Arc's inspirational leadership and tactical influence. Her impact highlights the profound psychological dimension of warfare and how charismatic leadership could galvanize disorganized forces, turning the tide of a protracted conflict and leading to further French successes, including the coronation of Charles VII. Battle of Manzikert, 1071. The Battle of Manzikert was a pivotal engagement in 1071 between the Byzantine Empire under Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes and the Seljuk Turks, led by Sultan Alp Arslan. The Byzantine army was a diverse force composed of various mercenary contingents, including Turkmen troops who would later defect. The Seljuks utilized a highly effective crescent formation of horse archers, positioning themselves about 4 kilometers away from the Byzantine forces. As the Byzantines advanced, the center of the Seljuk crescent continuously moved backward in a feigned retreat, while their wings moved to surround the Byzantine troops. This tactic lured the Byzantine army into disarray. The Byzantine position was further weakened by internal disunity and treachery, including the defection of their Turkmen troops and the flight of one of their generals, Andronicus Ducas. The outcome was catastrophic for the Byzantines. Their army was destroyed, and Emperor Romanus IV was captured, leading to significant territorial concessions to the Seljuks. This battle severely weakened the Byzantine Empire, opening its frontier to Oghuz tribesmen and leading to their increasing influence in Anatolia. Manzikert exemplifies the devastating effectiveness of nomadic horse archer tactics, particularly the feigned retreat and envelopment, against a more conventional, heavy infantry and cavalry army. The Byzantine defeat, compounded by internal disunity and the unreliability of mercenary forces, underscores the critical importance of cohesion and loyalty in large-scale engagements. It also showcased the strategic value of mobile, missile-based cavalry in certain terrains. The Battle of Hastings, 1066, was fought between the Normans and the English. The Normans won by using tactics such as a feigned retreat and a combination of archers, infantry, and cavalry. The English relied on a static shield wall and axes, which made them less flexible. Key factors in the Norman victory included tactical flexibility, discipline, and the shock effect of cavalry. The battle resulted in the Norman conquest and marked a significant shift in English military culture. The Battle of Crécy, 1346, was a conflict between the English and the French. The English used longbow volleys, took advantage of high ground, created anti-cavalry pits, and deployed flanking archers. The French tactics involved disorganized cavalry charges and lacked tactical cohesion. The decisive elements were the effectiveness of the longbow, use of terrain, and disciplined infantry. This battle led to English longbow dominance and signaled a decline in the traditional role of cavalry in battle. The Battle of Agincourt, 1415, was another clash between the English and the French. The English made use of narrow and muddy terrain, wooden stakes, massed longbow fire, and decisive command. The French were hampered by heavy armor in the mud, numerical overconfidence, and internal disunity. Terrain and the superiority of the longbow, along with pragmatic command, played a crucial role in the English victory. The result was the decimation of the French nobility and the strengthening of Henry V's claim to the French throne. The Siege of Orleans, 1428-29, saw the French fighting against the English. The French, led by Joan of Arc, employed inspirational leadership, aggressive sorties, and boosted morale. The English struggled with a protracted siege, overextension, and loss of initiative. The battle was decided by morale, leadership, and strategic initiative. It became a turning point in the Hundred Years' War, leading to a resurgence of French power. The Battle of Manzikert, 1071, occurred between the Seljuk Turks and the Byzantines. The Turks utilized horse archer envelopment, feigned retreats, and superior mobility. The Byzantines were undermined by internal treachery, reliance on mercenaries, and conventional tactics. Tactical superiority, internal disunity among the Byzantines, and the Turks' mobility determined the outcome. This battle marked the beginning of the Byzantine Empire's decline and allowed Turkish expansion into Anatolia. Part 4. Beyond the Battlefield, Logistics and Societal Impact. Logistical challenges and support. The logistical challenges faced by medieval armies were immense, directly limiting the scale, duration, and geographic reach of military campaigns. Maintaining effective supply chains for food, equipment, and medical supplies was critical for an army's effectiveness. In many instances, soldiers were required to provide their own clothing, weapons, armor, and even food, a stark contrast to modern military provisioning. Armies relied heavily on baggage trains, consisting of oxen and horse-drawn carts and wagons, to transport essential provisions. Establishing supply depots was crucial for prolonged campaigns, allowing for the storage of provisions. Transportation itself presented significant hurdles. Armies had to navigate challenging terrains and often poor road conditions, resulting in slow troop movements and difficulties in maintaining supply lines. Horses required regular rest breaks, and the sea transport of war horses was particularly complex and arduous. This involved large amounts of food and water, a single horse needing up to 20 pounds of feed per day, and cumbersome equipment like slings and winches for loading and unloading, often leading to high mortality rates among the animals. Merchants played an essential role in medieval warfare logistics. They facilitated the procurement and transportation of necessary goods such as food, wine, tents, and military equipment. Their understanding of currency and credit systems enabled the standardization of trade practices, ensuring armies were adequately supplied. However, when formal supply chains were insufficient, armies often resorted to living off the land through foraging or, more commonly, looting villages and pillaging the countryside. This necessity of living off the land had a devastating impact on local populations, creating a cycle of destruction that often outweighed the immediate impact of pitched battles. The raid or Chevauchée tactic, involving the ravaging of undefended material and agricultural resources, frequently resulted in widespread plundering, arson, rape, slaughter, and famine for helpless populations. Medieval armies also included a significant non-combatant support staff. This contingent comprised cooks, squires, blacksmiths, cobblers, laundresses, medical personnel, and sometimes even the wives and children of soldiers, all forming a vulnerable baggage train that needed protection. The immense logistical challenges directly limited the scale, duration, and geographic reach of military campaigns. However, The increasing complexity of military logistics, particularly for large-scale endeavors like the Crusades, spurred innovations in supply chain management and financial mechanisms, such as the involvement of merchants and credit systems. This pressure for better organization and resourcing contributed to the development of more sophisticated administrative structures within emerging states, linking military necessity to broader economic and governmental evolution. The role of military orders. The medieval period saw the rise of unique military orders, combining monastic vows with martial prowess, which played a pivotal role in warfare and broader societal development. Two of the most prominent were the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. The Knights Templar, formerly known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, were founded in 1118 with the initial mission to defend pilgrims on their dangerous journeys to Jerusalem. Endorsed by the Catholic Church through papal decrees, the Templars rapidly grew in membership and power, becoming a favored charity throughout Christendom. In their distinctive white mantles with a red cross, the Templar Knights were among the most skilled fighting units of the Crusades, often serving as advanced shock troops who would charge into enemy lines ahead of the main army. Beyond their military role, the majority of their members, as much as 90%, were non-combatants who managed a vast economic infrastructure across Christendom. They developed innovative financial techniques, such as issuing letters of credit for pilgrims, an early form of banking that protected travelers from robbery while augmenting Templar finances. Their wealth allowed them to acquire extensive lands, businesses, fleets of ships, and even, at one point, the entire island of Cyprus. The Knights Hospitaller, or the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, originated from a hospice founded in Jerusalem around 1070 by Italian merchants to care for pilgrims. Formally recognized by the Pope in 1113, the Hospitallers initially focused on medical care, but gradually militarized under Raymond Dupuy, taking on military responsibilities to keep pilgrim routes open. They became a major force in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, participating in wars against various enemies. After the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, they acquired strategic bases like the Greek island of Rhodes and later Malta, which afforded them control over vital trade routes and made them key players in Mediterranean geopolitics. These military orders played pivotal roles in the Crusades, participating in numerous significant battles and sieges aimed at securing and expanding Christian territories. Their international character and the necessity for rapid, accurate information exchange significantly contributed to communication developments across Europe and the Levant, fostering a more communication-oriented society in the late Middle Ages. Economically, they amassed vast wealth, becoming major landowners and financiers. Socially, they offered stability and protection to local communities and earned respect through charitable activities, embodying ideals of chivalry and piety. They also served as conduits for cultural and technical innovation, introducing banking facilities and practices like fulling into England. The dual military and economic functions of orders, like the Templars and Hospitallers, demonstrate a unique medieval adaptation to the challenges of long-distance warfare and fragmented political authority. Their financial innovations and extensive networks were not merely incidental but essential to sustaining their military operations and influence, highlighting the deep interdependency of finance and warfare. The rise and influence of these military orders represent a form of proto-state or transnational organization, operating beyond traditional feudal boundaries. Their ability to centralize resources, maintain discipline, and develop sophisticated logistical and financial systems provided a model for later state-building efforts, even as they sometimes challenged secular authority. Societal consequences of warfare. Medieval warfare, far from being confined to battlefields, had profound and pervasive societal impacts, acting as a major catalyst for demographic shifts, economic transformations, and political centralization. Impact on the nobility. Wars profoundly altered social structures, particularly for the nobility, who were the military elite. While nobles initially held significant power due to their ability to provide military service, wars frequently led to shifts in power dynamics. Victorious nobles could gain lands and titles, increasing their influence, while defeated ones could lose their status or even their lives. The medieval European nobility frequently engaged in private wars or feuds, which they considered legitimate means of pursuing their rights, reflecting a decentralized system of peace. However, the rising cost of warfare, particularly with the advent of expensive plate armor and professional armies, and the emergence of stronger, more centralized monarchies, gradually diminished the ability of ordinary nobles to keep up. This led to a decline in private warfare as states increasingly suppressed it within their territories. Impact on the peasantry. The peasantry bore a disproportionate burden of medieval warfare. Constant conflict, combined with other calamities like famine and disease, most notably the Black Death, led to high mortality rates and significant population declines across Europe. The Black Death, which swept through England in 1348, for instance, caused a diminished workforce, leading to increased wages for working peasants and ultimately contributing to the breakdown of feudalism in England. However, attempts by the upper classes to cap these rising wages, as seen in England's Statute of Labours, fueled widespread peasant revolts, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 and the German Peasants' War, which were often brutally suppressed. Beyond these large-scale movements, peasants repeatedly suffered from plundering, arson, rape, slaughter, and famine during military campaigns, as armies often resorted to living off the land. Impact on urban populations. Military conflict played a key role in the rise of urban Europe. Cities often served as safe harbors during times of conflict, attracting rural inhabitants threatened by the destructive effects of warfare. This relocation to cities for protection led to significant urban population growth. Conflict exposure was associated with an average increase of 6 to 11% in city populations per century, accounting for roughly a quarter of average per-century city population growth over the period. This phenomenon promoted historical development through agglomeration economies, concentrating labor and resources. Economic consequences. The financial burden of warfare was immense, leading to increased taxation that heavily burdened the lower classes and stifled economic growth. Wars caused widespread destruction of property and infrastructure, particularly in France during the 100 Years' War, disrupting trade and agriculture, which in turn led to food shortages and price inflation. Currency debasement by warring states further eroded the living standards of a population and contributed to social unrest. However, the relentless need to finance these increasingly expensive wars also acted as a powerful catalyst for the development of more centralized and efficient taxation systems. This modernization of taxation due to war strengthened monarchical power and laid the groundwork for modern states, as seen in France, where the taxation system became more centralized and efficient. Long-term societal effects. The Crusades, a series of religious wars, sparked significant cultural and economic revolutions in medieval Europe. They exposed Europeans to new ideas, technologies, and goods, transforming their societies. This exchange led to the expansion of trade routes between Europe and the Middle East, increasing demand for luxury goods and facilitating the growth of Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa as major trading centers. Politically, the Crusades strengthened the power of European monarchs through increased prestige and authority, leading to the consolidation of land and resources. They also contributed to the emergence of knightly orders and the concept of chivalry, which influenced literature and social norms. However, these conflicts also intensified religious and cultural differences, leading to persistent mistrust and hostility between Muslims and Christians, a legacy that continues to resonate. Medieval warfare, far from being confined to isolated military engagements, had profound and pervasive societal impacts, acting as a major catalyst for demographic shifts, economic transformations, and political centralization. The safe harbor effect of cities and the Black Death's impact on labor are examples of how conflict and crisis reshaped the very fabric of medieval society. The long-term economic and social pressures generated by constant warfare, particularly exemplified by the 100 Years' War, contributed significantly to the decline of the feudal system and the rise of early modern nation-states. The increased power of monarchs through centralized taxation and the emergence of new social classes, such as wealthy merchants and professional soldiers, were direct consequences of the evolving demands and impacts of medieval conflict. Economic and societal impacts of medieval warfare. Nobility experienced significant power shifts, a loss of status or even lives, and a decline in the prevalence of private wars. These changes were driven by the high cost of new armor and castles, the consolidation of royal power, and a transforming military landscape. Peasantry suffered from labor shortages and saw an increase in wages following the Black Death. However, they also faced revolts and widespread suffering caused by plundering and famine. These effects stemmed from the devastation of the Black Death, wage disputes, the presence of armies living off the land, and ongoing feudal obligations. Urban populations grew significantly as cities became seen as safe harbors. This growth was influenced by conflicts in rural areas, the population's need for protection, and the benefits of agglomeration economies, where people and services clustered together for mutual benefit. The economy was marked by increased taxation, inflation, widespread destruction, and trade disruptions. These challenges were caused by the high costs of war, debasement of currency, the urgent need for revenue, and the absence of modern financial systems. Political structures shifted toward greater centralization of the state. Feudalism declined, monarchical power grew stronger, and new social classes began to emerge. These changes were driven by the need for stable revenue, the formation of professional armies, and the rise of military orders functioning like early organizational structures. Conclusion: the enduring legacy of medieval warfare. The study of medieval warfare reveals a dynamic and transformative period, far from a static image of unorganized clashes. The journey began with decentralized feudal levies, characterized by variable training and equipment, and progressed towards more organized, specialized forces, such as the highly effective Swiss pikemen and the English longbowmen. This evolution was mirrored in the architectural arms race of fortifications, which saw castles develop from simple timber motte baileys to impregnable stone keeps and complex concentric designs, all in response to the parallel advancements in siegecraft. Concurrently, there was continuous innovation in weaponry and armor, from the development of specialized swords and pole arms to the increasing power of ranged weapons, culminating in the revolutionary impact of gunpowder, which fundamentally altered the calculus of offensive and defensive capabilities. These technological and architectural shifts propelled corresponding changes in battlefield tactics, moving from individualistic cavalry charges to sophisticated combined arms approaches and the strategic exploitation of terrain to maximize military advantage. A central theme throughout this period was the gradual transition towards more centralized and professional armies. The financial demands of increasingly expensive warfare, coupled with the inherent limitations of feudal service, compelled kings to develop more robust taxation systems and to rely increasingly on paid, professional forces. This shift contributed to the decline of the knights' battlefield dominance, as disciplined infantry and massed archers proved capable of overcoming traditional heavy cavalry. The emergence of early professional armies, even if small and costly, marked a significant step away from the decentralized military structures of the early Middle Ages. The lasting influence of medieval warfare is evident in its profound impact on military strategy, fortification, and societal structures. Medieval innovations in fortification and siege warfare laid crucial foundations for later military engineering, with lessons learned about defensive layering and the power of artillery. The tactical lessons from battles like Crécy and Agincourt, demonstrating the power of combined arms, terrain advantage, and disciplined missile fire, continue to resonate as enduring principles of military strategy. Beyond the immediate military sphere, the constant state of conflict drove significant demographic, economic, and political shifts. The safe harbor effect of cities, attracting rural populations seeking protection, led to urban growth and economic development. The Black Death, exacerbated by wartime conditions, caused labor shortages that contributed to the breakdown of feudalism. The economic strain of war, including increased taxation and inflation, compelled states to develop more centralized and efficient financial administrations. The entire narrative of medieval warfare, from its decentralized beginnings to its increasingly centralized and professionalized forms, can be understood as a long, often brutal, process of state building. The constant pressure of conflict forced innovations in finance, administration, military technology, and social organization. The modernization of taxation, driven by the need to fund wars, directly strengthened monarchical power and contributed to the early development of nation-states. The evolution of military organization, the increasing cost of warfare, and the resulting societal disruptions ultimately laid the essential groundwork for the modern nation-state, making medieval warfare a fundamental engine of historical transformation.